Welcome to the Modern Manager. I am Amy Canfor-Stewart, and every week I share tips and strategies to help you be a rockstar manager with a thriving team. And today we are talking about a topic that I think every manager has experienced, which is getting stuck in a decision process. And so whether it is you personally stuck with a decision or your team feeling stuck and kind of spinning around and not being able to figure out how to move forward, today we're going to talk about why this happens and what you can do to get unstuck. Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a new interview or a new lesson like this one. So coming up, I'm going to share 5 practical approaches to getting past that moment of being stuck. But before we do that, I think it's really important to understand the psychological, emotional, and practical reasons that we end up in this kind of mental roadblock place. So let's take a look at some of the core reasons that we get stuck. The first reason that we get stuck is fear of making a mistake. We get into that decision paralysis moment because we worry with all of the what ifs. What if this happens? And what if that doesn't happen? And then it just leads us to being unsure and not very confident about the decision that we're going to make. And so we start to live in this place of fear of making the wrong decision or fear that the decision isn't going to be perfect. If we have those perfectionist tendencies or we feel like there's a lot of pressure on us to get it right, then we get stuck into that. I don't want to get it wrong. It needs to be perfect. And we're not able to make a confident decision and move forward. The second reason that we can get stuck is because we are overwhelmed with too many options. Choice overload. And we're not really sure how to evaluate them. And we start to just second guess everything because we can't really make sense of what's on the table in front of us. And we get overwhelmed with the amount of information and the options. And so we just kind of end up spinning our circles trying to figure out what are we going to do because there's just too many potential paths forward. Another reason that we get stuck is because we have unclear priorities, goals, criteria, or assumptions. And in this case, we're basically taking a shot in the dark when we're having a conversation around decision because we're all coming at it from different perspectives, but we don't really know what we're trying to accomplish. We don't really know which of these options are aligned with our ultimate goals or how the conversation is being influenced by our different perspectives and assumptions. And so we end up kind of talking around each other or just showing up with different thinking where we can't really seem to find common ground because we actually don't have shared understanding. Another reason we get stuck is when we have emotional complications about a decision. When our emotions are running high, we don't think straight. When a group is having an emotional experience, it can feel really heated and it can feel like there are winners and losers and we don't want that. And so we end up just stuck in this decision space. Sometimes those emotions are really valid and they can be based on past experience or expertise or the way that we are going to be impacted by a decision. But sometimes those emotions need to be acknowledged and put aside because they're getting in the way of us actually being able to move forward with what makes the most sense for the situation. And lastly, sometimes we get stuck making a decision because there's too much uncertainty. We're not clear about the future. We're not clear about what's going to happen if we make a particular decision. And sometimes we start to wonder, well, if I just wait 2 more days, 2 more weeks, 2 more months before making this decision, I'm going to have so much more information and therefore I'll be able to make a better decision. And that is not always the case, but that lack of certainty, the ambiguity that can come from making a decision in one way or another can hold us back from making a decision with confidence. Now, these different reasons that we get stuck in decision-making processes often intertwine, and they are not necessarily completely independent. And so you might find confounding factors that are putting your team into those kind of spinning conversations where you can't seem to figure out how to move forward together. By understanding what some of these causes might be, it helps you recognize them when they're happening and also figure out what the right solution is to get you from being stuck in the conversation to confidently moving forward. So now that we've unpacked what happens when you're getting stuck and why it happens, let's talk about the 5 different approaches that you could use to help yourself and your team get unstuck. The first is to clarify your values, your priorities, your goals, and your assumptions. The more clear we can be about what lenses we're using to evaluate a decision, the easier it is for all of us to get aligned. So make a list of what you're trying to accomplish, what success in the end looks like. even bigger than what this decision is, but how this decision fits into the larger picture. Make a list of the criteria that you're considering. I even recommend to my clients, and I love using this tool with teams myself, to list out our criteria and then prioritize it by weighting it, because not all the criteria is equally important. And then we can even evaluate our different options against the criteria. And we can do it individually and we can do it as a group. And we can really start to see where are we having differences of opinions about the importance of criteria and where are we having difference of opinions around how a solution or an option fits that criteria. The same is true for explaining your assumptions and surfacing what is underlying your perspective. The more articulate we can be about our perspective and why we're holding this perspective, the easier it is to talk about the things that are actually in the way of us coming together and making that decision. The second strategy is thinking through what is the best case scenario and what is the worst case scenario with each of the options. And then asking yourself, what can we live with? This strategy is one of my absolute favorites because a lot of times we think the worst case scenario is much worse than it actually is. And we think the best case scenario is often much better than it actually is. And when we can put all of this in context, we can start to look and say, can I live with these worst case results if the benefit is this best case opportunity, and vice versa? So I'll give you a real life example with this one. I had been told for a long time to start a video podcast, and I really, really did not want to do video. Big surprise, even though I'm doing video now. Clearly, I made this decision. But at the time, I kept thinking, I don't know what to do here. I don't know if I need to go onto video, if I can survive just as a podcast. And so I asked myself this best case, worst case. And I said, if I stay with just an audio podcast, which I had been doing for a number of years and very successfully, what was the best case scenario? The best case was the show would continue to grow steadily, probably wasn't going to have some big explosion at that point. So best case was it was going to keep going in a positive direction. Worst case was video was going to totally take over and people were going to stop listening to podcasts and the show was going to become irrelevant. Not so good. Flip side, best case, worst case for starting video. Well, best case, I become a huge YouTube star, which I'm still waiting for that to happen. Worst case is the show I don't get a lot of followers. I look super awkward on camera. I put something out into the world that feels super embarrassing and it lives forever on YouTube and nobody watches it. Or a lot of people watch it and I'm really embarrassed by how I look on it, but it still helped a lot of people, hopefully. And I started really thinking about, all right, so worst case scenario, nobody watches the video, or I look, a little awkward, embarrassed while I'm figuring out how to do video. But the upside of reaching a lot more people and staying relevant to my market and being able to share the message that I have and help people become better managers, that upside was way better. And the downside really wasn't as bad as I had been making it out to be. And so the decision became much clearer because the upside of continuing in the audio podcast compared to the downside of becoming irrelevant and losing the opportunity to help folks, that really sucked. That would be really bad. So the decision suddenly became a lot clearer, even though it felt uncomfortable to make that decision. The third strategy is called make a decision for the moment. A lot of times we can feel like we have to make a decision and then that's it. We can't revisit it. And sometimes there's good reason that we don't want to revisit a decision. We don't want to rehash it with our team. We want to be able to just commit and get moving. But sometimes when you're stuck around a decision, being that forceful and making a commitment to the big decision can actually become problematic and keep us in that stuck mode, feeling like we have to get it right. And so instead, think about what can we commit to for the moment? Can we take just the first step towards one of our options? Can we take just a small step in a particular direction? Can we make this decision for the moment? And then let's revisit in a certain time period. Let's revisit in 2 weeks or in 30 days. Or let's revisit if X, Y, and Z happens and we get some signals that this decision maybe isn't quite the right one. That way, you're allowing yourself to move in a direction without having to be fully committed to getting rid of your other options and leaving the door open to revisit when you need to. The fourth strategy for getting unstuck with your decisions is to consider what information is missing and how that information might help you make a different decision. When I'm working with a team and they are getting stuck in indecision and there's conversations spinning around and there's a lot of what ifs and if only we knew that, they kind of get into that place where it feels like they really want more information. They want more research to be able to make a decision confidently. And so I like to ask them, well, what information, if you had it, would solidify the decision for you? And sometimes it's super clear. We say, great, can we get that information or get close to that kind of information? And if it's not that hard to do, then let's go out and do it. And other times we say, you know what? That information is never going to come, or it would be so expensive or so time consuming to get that information that we're just going to have to make a decision without it. And so we need to stop wishing that we had it. And sometimes even they identify what information they'd like to have, and then they realize it wouldn't actually make that much of a difference if we had that information. It wouldn't really impact choice A over choice B. And we can now let go of that information because we recognize that it's actually not critical to being able to make our choice here. The last strategy number 5, is to clarify who the decision maker is. I cannot tell you how many times I have been in meetings where we are in a conversation and we're spinning around our decision, and then we stop and say, wait a second, who's making this decision? Because it's really different if the group is trying to come to consensus and we need to all buy in at least at a baseline to support the decision versus we're actually consultative to one person here. Ultimately, that one person gets to decide and we are just giving them advice and our thoughts, but we don't actually have to agree. That person's going to ultimately decide. And so it doesn't matter if we're spinning around because we've had our conversation and that person's going to decide and we can be done, which is also different than if you're doing a majority vote. So when you are stuck in a decision, we kind of assume that we're going for consensus, but that's not always the case. And so if you're finding yourself unable to reach consensus with your team, then just take a step back and ask, who's truly the decision maker here? Do we need to all be in agreement? Or is there one person or a subset of folks who are actually the decision makers? And do they have enough information from us as a group now to be able to go off and make that decision confidently? Each of these methods can be used alone or in combination to help you move out of a place of indecision and spinning and feeling stuck into that place of moving forward. So whether you are trying to make a decision on your own or with your team, I hope you found today's content valuable. For more tips and tricks on how to make good decisions, as well as how to be a rockstar manager with a thriving team, check out my site, themodernmanager.com. And while you're here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a video and check out my latest.